Hey everyone, it's Jananie and welcome back to my channel. This story ain't over. So recently during these winter nights when it's super cold outside, when it's snowing in Canada, I feel like my favorite thing to do is grab a cup of tea and curl up with a really nice steamy romance book and just waste the night away. I feel like romance books during the winter is such a vibe. So today I'm going to be recommending you various romance books that you can read for this season, ranging from medium spicy books to very spicy books to historical romances to some romances that have a touch of fantasy. Now, speaking of tea though, today's video is being kindly sponsored by Chapters Tea and Coffee. Chapters Tea and Coffee is this really awesome small business that makes these bookish themed teas, and they were kind enough to send me a bunch of their teas to test out and try, and honestly these are so wonderful. As I said, I've been loving curling up with a book in the evenings with a cup of tea, especially because I'm trying to reduce my caffeine intake. And what's nice about Chapters Tea and Coffee is that they mark on the back how much caffeine each of their blends have, and some of them are caffeine free. I absolutely love the gorgeous packaging to these teas, and Chapters Tea and Coffee also sells these really beautiful bookmarks that come with wonderful quotes from books on the back. And out of the ones that they sent me, this one, Picnic at Pemberley, is definitely my favorite. It's inspired by Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Pemberley is the name of Darcy's estate house in the book. It's a loose leaf green tea with jasmine flowers and rose petals, which I just absolutely love. It's the tea that I'm drinking right now, and jasmine and rose are just some of my favorite flavors, especially in tea. One of the things I really love about all of the teas is that they have really quality tea leaves, and just opening these up, the smell is just so freaking beautiful. All of the flavor profiles are delicious, and a lot of the teas can also be made iced or hot. So if you're looking for some new teas to try out, or if you're hoping to curl up with a cup of tea with your romance books that I'm recommending to you today, then I highly recommend checking out Chapters Tea and Coffee. You can actually grab a 15% discount with my code Jananie15. It's in the description and there's a link down below. Thank you so much to Chapters Tea and Coffee for sponsoring today's video, and now let's get into some of the medium spicy books that I want to recommend to you today. Okay, so what do I mean by medium spicy? These are just the romance books that I think have a little bit of spiciness. Like, there are some sex scenes, but they're pretty tame and they're mostly off the page, or they're just not as explicit as some of the other steamy books that I've read. Now, one thing I do want to say to preface this entire video is that I do understand that a lot of these books are very cis, very straight, very hetero, so I'm definitely on the hunt for more queer romance book recs, so if you have them, please leave them down below. However, the first romance I'm going to start with is indeed a queer romance book, and that is Honey Girl by Morgan Rogers. This is partly a romance book, but also more a contemporary fiction. It follows our main character, Grace Porter, who has just finished her PhD, and she's sort of trying to figure out what to do with her life. And when she goes on this spontaneous girls trip to Vegas to celebrate her PhD, she ends up drunkenly getting married to a random woman that she meets. From there, we follow Grace as she's trying to figure out the identity of her wife, who ends up being this woman named Yuki, and they start to find that they are very drawn to each other, even despite the very drunken situation that led to their marriage. The romance in this book was just so stunningly done, and my heart was definitely fluttering for Yuki. Next up, I have The Roughest Draft by Emily Wibberley and Austin Sigmund Broca. If you didn't know, the authors of this book are actually a married couple, which I find pretty cute. But this is essentially a romance between two writers who used to be like co-authors, but because of a falling out, they no longer write together. However, at the beginning of this book, we find out that they still have technically one book under contract, and so they are forced to begrudgingly come back together and write this final book together so that both of them can achieve their own ends with this new book release. So we follow our characters as they hole up in this Florida cottage to try and write this romance book as they're dealing with their own complicated feelings for each other. This one definitely had a really fun premise, but I will say that it's a bit more on the darker, more serious side in some aspects, and there's definitely a lot of angst going on between the characters. Speaking of a more serious romance, this next one is Before I Let Go by Kennedy Ryan. This involves a divorced couple who are still co-parenting their children and find themselves sort of drawn back to each other as they both realize that they're now in a better place of healing than they were previously. Despite knowing that this was a romance book, I remember reading this book and just thinking, oh my god, what if they don't end up together at the end? Because I just loved these characters so freaking much. Both of the characters on their own were just spectacular, but I also think that this book does a really wonderful job of discussing mental illness and mental health, and really talks about how it's sometimes difficult to heal together in a relationship, and how sometimes you need to learn to grow and heal on your own before you can bring yourself fully to the relationship. This one had some wonderful steamy scenes in it, and I think it's more spicy than the last couple that I recommended, but there's also some really great side storylines that are going on as well that make the overall book really interesting. If you're looking for a book that's going to tug at your heartstrings and totally really break your heart, then this is definitely one to pick up. Now, before we get into the next romance book rec, I just want to remind you guys all that if you're enjoying my content, please like and subscribe down below. And also, if you want more exclusive content from me, then definitely go check out my bindery community down below. I post monthly TBR videos there and do monthly live stream hangouts with my members. And I also do regular updates on the progress that I'm making on the vlogs that I'm doing and give you journal updates on what's going on in my life. So if any of that seems enticing to you, definitely go check out my bindery community down below and subscribe and support me for the price of a latte. Next up, I have probably one of my favorite romances ever, and that is 7 Days in June by Tia Williams. This is again another second chance romance, and it involves this pair of writers who essentially fell in love many years ago over 7 days in June, and they were meeting again for 7 days in June when they're both these successful writers, and they've essentially been writing to each other through their books over these past years. So we have Eva and Shane. Shane writes these like really serious literary novels, and then Eva writes these like supernatural romance novels. And when they meet again, they're trying to figure out what happened all those years ago and why they were separated. And they're also just trying to figure out who this person has become after all these years. This was such a stunning romance and had some really beautiful character growth for our main character. And I also just really loved each of our main characters on their own because they were just really wonderful people. If you're looking for a book to kind of break your heart quite a bit, this one is definitely gonna do that. Alrighty, next up I have 4 books by the same author, and this is an author that's very popular, so I'm not gonna talk too much about each of these, but those books are the Emily Henry books. So first up I have Beach Read, which was her first major romance book. This basically follows 2 writers who end up in neighboring beach houses over the summer, and both of them are under writing deadlines, and they end up striking this like unlikely bargain to try and write in the other person's genre. To give you some context, these 2 characters have a bit of a rivalry prior to this situation, and so they're both trying to one-up each other but also discover something new about themselves. This book has an element of dealing with the grief because our main character is taking this beach house that was owned by her father who has recently passed. And overall, I think the thing that I loved the most about this book was just the lead up to the characters getting together. It was just so artfully done, and you're just like waiting on the edge of your seat for them to just finally kiss. The next Emily Henry book is People We Meet on Vacation. This is a classic friends to lovers romance. It follows our 2 main characters, Poppy and Alex, who become friends early on in university, but they're both from very different places in the States. But because of their friendship and because Poppy really loves to travel, they end up taking these yearly vacations together, and they do this for over a decade until 2 years ago when something went wrong. And so the book flips between the current timeline when they have this rocky relationship and the different vacations that they've taken over the past decade. I really loved seeing the progression of the romance over the course of the decade. It was really beautiful to see, and I also just personally really like friends to lovers romances, so this one was a treat. And then we have Book Lovers, which probably ties with Beach Read in terms of my favorite Emily Henry book. This basically follows a cutthroat literary agent and a book editor who end up falling for each other in a small town over one summer. Our main character, who is the cutthroat literary agent, Nora, she is the type of woman who lives in the city, who is very icy, who has time and time again seen herself to not be the heroine in her love story. But she decides to take a trip with her sister to this small town, Sunshine Falls, where she keeps repeatedly running into the book editor, Charlie, who she's met before many times in the city, and it's never really gone well, but this time things start to change quite a bit. What I loved about this book was that it was so very bookish, and I appreciated sort of the idea of turning tropes on its head, as well as the really beautiful progression of the romance in the book. I think the chemistry between the characters was just so wonderful, and I was just like holding my breath waiting for them to get together. And then the last Emily Henry book is probably my least favorite, but I know a lot of people love this one, and that is Happy Place. This book is essentially a story of this broken up couple that end up having to fake that they're still together because of this yearly friend group trip that they take to the cottage. So we're essentially following them as they're trying to fake the fact that they haven't broken up, and we're also trying to figure out why they broke up in the first place. Although the romance in this one didn't click as much for me, I really did appreciate the discussions of mental health in this book, and also just the idea that sometimes you find family in your friends rather than the family that you have. Alrighty, next up I want to talk about some romances that actually feature a bit of fantasy elements, or they are actual fantasy books, but I personally feel like the romance is the main focus of these books. First up I have The 7-Year Slip by Ashley Poston. This basically follows our main character Clementine West, who is a book publicist, and she's really focused mainly only on her career for most of her life. But when her beloved aunt dies a year previously, she is sort of reeling from that grief and doesn't really know what she wants out of her life anymore. Now, when her aunt died, she did leave her old apartment in the city, and so our main character ends up moving moving into that apartment, and she ends up encountering the little magical ability that this apartment has to take you back 7 years or 7 years forward in time. So her aunt has already explained this mysterious phenomenon to Clementine, but she ends up experiencing it firsthand when she meets this lovely young man who wants to become a chef in the apartment, and he is subletting from her aunt 7 years ago, and she is falling in love with him. But she is also encountered with his current self these 7 years later in her current timeline. This is a book of, missed opportunities and missed chances, but also the idea of how you grow on your own really affects how you appear in a relationship. I love the way that these characters sort of fall in love and how they have very different ideas of each other because she is meeting him, in her current time, but he's met her 7 years ago. So if you love romances with themes of timing, then I highly recommend picking up this one. Next, I have a book talk favorite romance that I can never get enough of, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This is the wonderful, beautiful romance between Patroclus and Achilles. This is essentially a retelling of the Iliad and like the whole mythology story of Achilles, but we're following the perspective of Patroclus, his friend from his childhood, and also the man who becomes his lover. This is sort of the story that is implied in the Iliad, but we never actually get to see full on what it's like, and so this sort of fills that gap, and it's just such a beautiful, beautiful story and beautiful romance. I remember just being so captivated by these characters and just the love and devotion between them as I was reading this for the first time, and it's definitely a book that is a huge tearjerker by the end. Please prepare your tissues. Next, I have The Beautiful Ones by Silvia Moreno Garcia. Silvia Moreno Garcia is one of my favorite authors, and this book in particular is one of her fantasies that actually is more a romance in my opinion. It's essentially a fantasy version of a Regency era romance. It involves 3 main characters and a bit of a love triangle and a revenge plot, and essentially it involves this courtship between this man named Hector, who is an entertainer and sort of brings himself up in life to the level of these socialites, and is courting our main character Nina in order to take revenge on his previous love. But the romance that ends up developing between these 2 characters and the way that the characters change their perspectives on each other and on love is just so beautifully done. If you're a fan of Jane Austen and Regency era romances, then this is definitely one to pick up. Alrighty, and then the last fantasy book that I have that is really more of a romance is A Dowry of Blood by S.T. Gibson. So this book involves a depiction of an abusive relationship, and that's not the relationship that I'm talking about or the romance that I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about the polyamorous relationship that also develops in this book involving Dracula's brides. So this is definitely a book that has a lot of queer representation, this polyamorous relationship, and just seeing the deep devotion and love between these characters was just so beautiful, and honestly just like the highlight of this book. This book takes us through time as our main character Constanta is sort of recounting her life with Dracula and, the later brides who come to join them. And it also details her just dealing with this like abusive relationship over these centuries and how her idea of love changes over these years. This is thrilling and seductive and definitely will scratch that romance itch. Alrighty, next up I'm gonna dive into some historical romances that I absolutely love, and most of these are like really historical romances, but I have a couple from the same series that are actually more recent historical romances. So those 2 books are by Chanel Cleeton. So I have Next Year in Havana and When We Left Cuba. So Next Year in Havana flips between 2 different timelines, and in both timelines there is a romance. One is in 2017 when we follow Marisol as she travels to Cuba to sort of reconnect with her heritage and with the life that her grandmother Elisa lived. She ends up meeting a man there in Cuba and starts to learn more about the political situation in Cuba and ends up falling for him along the way. And then in the other timeline, we're following Marisol's grandmother Elisa in 1958, and this is when she happened to be having a clandestine affair with a revolutionary in Havana. This delves into Cuba's high society from the 50s and all of the political unrest during that time, and just overall features these 2 really heartbreaking romances set in this dramatic political backdrop. When We Left Cuba is the companion to Next Year in Havana and chronologically takes place after the story of Elisa in 1958, and this follows Elisa's sister Beatrice in 1960s Florida after her family flees Cuba and ends up in the United States. Beatrice is consumed with this quest for revenge for what has happened to her people, and with the Cold War swirling in the background, Beatrice finds herself in a forbidden love affair with this powerful man. I will say that these books are a bit different from the traditional romance, so I wouldn't expect completely happily ever afters, but I do really love the romances that blossom in each of these. Now, if you've been following my channel for a while, you know that I am a huge fan of historical romances, especially The Bridgerton series. I absolutely love the TV show, and a couple years ago when the second season came out, I decided to read the books. I have a whole video going over them and my review for the first 5 books, but today I wanted to recommend the first 3 because these are probably my favorite ones. Now, as I recommend these, I would like to say that these books came out quite a while ago, so there are parts of them that are a bit icky if you are reading them in current day, but overall I do really love like the setup of these and like the historical romance aspect and sort of the Gossip Girl nature to the story. Essentially in the series we're following this one family called the Bridgertons, and each book of the Bridgerton series follows the romance of a different sibling. So the first book starts with our eldest daughter Daphne, who ends up falling for the Duke of Hastings, Simon Bassett, who is a bit of a rake and who is determined to spite his father, who treated him horribly as a child. This book in particular involves a fake dating trope and then more of like a friends to lovers situation, and I honestly really enjoyed it. The second book is The Viscount Who Loved Me, which follows the eldest son's storyline, which is Anthony, and in this book we have more of a hate to love situation with Anthony falling in love with the older sister of the girl that he's courting. This one was a really fun one and had some really great lines, and I love the tension between these two characters, and overall it's just a really enjoyable read. And then the third Bridgerton book, which is probably my favorite one, is An Offer from a Gentleman, and this one follows the second oldest brother, which is Benedict. And the reason I really like this book is because it kind of takes a Cinderella-esque story and in my opinion felt a little bit different from the previous books because our main love interest is a girl who is not a noblewoman and she comes from this sort of poor background, and the circumstances of their class sort of keep these two characters apart. Aside from the whole class element that makes this a Cinderella-esque story, there's also an element of the first scene in the book involving Benedict meeting our main character as she is dressed up in masquerade for a ball. So if you wanted some Cinderella vibes in your historical romance, I highly recommend picking this one up. Speaking of historical romances, recently I've been on like a historical romance binge, and I recently found out that there is actually a Palestinian author who writes a bunch of historical romances, and so I picked up The Duke Gets Desperate by Diana Quincy. So as I said, Diana Quincy is a Palestinian author, and this book actually features like an Arab Palestinian main character. Her name is Rhea Darwish, and she's traveling from America to England when a cousin of hers suddenly dies and leaves her this castle that was originally owned by her late husband. And from there, Rhea ends up meeting the son of the original owner of the castle, who is the Duke of Strickland. And the Duke of Strickland feels like he's been cheated out of his, childhood home, his castle, and so he and Rhea end up butting heads over this castle, and she's trying to start some new business ventures, and this is sort of set at the turn of the century when great English homes are a thing of the past and America is slowly making its way up in the world. Although this wasn't my favorite romance and it was a little bit over the top at some points, I just really enjoyed the fun nature of it. It was just really enjoyable, and there are a lot of fun and hilarious moments in this book and some really fun steamy scenes. Now Diana Quincy has another series that came out before The Duke Gets Desperate, and this series also involves Arab Palestinian main characters, which is really awesome. So I recently finished Her Night with the Duke, and I'm in the middle of The Viscount Made Me Do It, and then the third book is The Marquis Makes His Move. These are all companion novels, but they involve like different characters that you meet in some of the earlier books. Her Night with the Duke was actually so much fun, and I actually liked it a lot more than The Duke Gets Desperate. It essentially follows our main character, Delilah Chambers, who ends up in this like country in one night stranded, and she ends up spending the night with this man that she doesn't know. He's a stranger, and they both just have this wonderful night and then part ways. But it turns out that he is actually a duke, and he is courting her stepdaughter, whom she loves like a sister. She's actually similar in age because the man she was married to was much older, and so she's in this sticky situation where she was with this man who is now courting her stepdaughter, and he is also like blinded with love for her, and it's just so freaking fantastic. It was so much fun. If you love historical romances, if you like Bridgerton, this is definitely a book to pick up. Alrighty, we're on to the last home stretch, and we're into more of the spicier romance book recs. I will say though that the Bridgerton and Diana Quincy books are very steamy as well, so just keep that in mind. But first up in this category, I have the books by Talia Hibbert, the Brown Sisters trilogy. So this is a set of books that each follow a different sister in the Brown Sisters family. So the first book is Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and it follows the eldest daughter in the family, and she is this chronically ill computer geek who ends up in this situation where she falls in love with the superintendent at her building. This wasn't my favorite out of the series, but it is still really cute and has some wonderful steamy scenes, and it really just taps into this idea of trying to make the most of your life, getting a life, and letting go of some of the fears that you have. The second book is Take a Hint, Dani Brown, which follows the second daughter, Dani Brown. Dani Brown is a PhD student and she's a go-getter. She knows what she wants out of life, but she's all but given up on romance, and she finds herself very often emotionally distancing herself from her romantic partners. And at the beginning of the book, she's getting out of this relationship with this woman that she was with. She's bisexual, so there's that representation, but she finds herself in a bit of a fake dating situation with the security guard at the school. This basically takes us through all of the typical fake dating relationship things, and it was honestly just so well done. This is probably my favorite out of the entire series, and I really loved our main love interest, Zafir. And then the third book is Act Your Age, Eve Brown, which follows the third sister, the very chaotic one, the one that doesn't know what she's doing with her life. She's a certified hot mess, and she's been given an ultimatum by her parents to just get her life together and act her age. And so she finds herself taking this job at this bed and breakfast that's owned by the love interest. Now, the love interest, Jacob, is a bit of a straight-laced man and, you know, always wants things in control. And Eve is anything but control. She's all chaos. And so she sets off all of his tics, and the two of them are sort of butting heads, but then also falling for each other along the way. One thing I really loved about this book was the neurodivergence representation in it. So if you're looking for that, I'd highly recommend picking this up. Speaking of neurodivergent representation in romances, The Kiss Quotient also does a really great job of this. This is by Helen Huang. Essentially, we follow our main character, Stella Lane, who has Asperger's or autism. And while she's very successful in her career, she struggles with romance. And so she ends up hiring a professional to teach her how to do romance. So this professional takes the form of an escort named Michael Fan. And while he initially rejects her offer, she comes back with a plan of how he can teach her to deal with romantic situations. He ends up giving in and taking her along for the ride. This book could be described as a fake dating trope, but I just really loved the tenderness that develops between Stella and Michael. And the steamy scenes in this book were just so fantastic, so that was definitely a plus. Alrighty, and then the last three books that I have on this list are all by the same author, and that is Ali Hazelwood. Ali Hazelwood is known for writing these books that all involve main characters who are in STEM fields, so science, technology, engineering, and math. Her first book involves a overworked PhD student who ends up falling for this professor, and they end up in a fake dating relationship that sort of serves both of their ends. But of course, the fake dating shifts into a real romance, and this book in particular has a lot of like cringy parts to it that you may not enjoy depending on who you are, but I honestly was like cringing but also giggling and like, you know, thinking it was all really cute. So I still really enjoy this one, but I do think it's the weakest out of all of her books. Her second book, Love on the Brain, has more of a working situation and involves these two rival engineers, you could say. Basically, our main character B ends up accepting this position at NASA, but she's forced to work with this man who sort of snubbed her back in university. And so he's essentially making her life really hard at the lab, and she's sort of trying to deal with that, but then you start to realize that there's some misunderstandings going on, and the romance is quite fun in this one and really cute. The romance in this one is less cringy than the one in The Love Hypothesis, but I will say that this book has a bit of a batshit crazy ending. There's this really interesting like secondary plot that happens in the book that sort of takes this wild turn by the end of the book, so that was fun, but depending on the person, you may not enjoy that one. Now, Ali Hazelwood's newest book is probably my favorite one, and that is Love Theoretically. This book is definitely the more rivals to lovers situation. Essentially, we follow our main character, Elsie, who is diabetic, and she is a theoretical physicist, and she's been struggling as an adjunct professor without any health benefits for years, and she's just really trying to find a steady professor position. And so when one opens up at the physics department in MIT, she jumps on the chance, but she is faced with one of her academic rivals, Jack Smith, who is an experimental physicist, and experimental physicists have like a bone to pick with theoretical physicists, and there's like rivalry there. But she also knows him from her other job where she moonlights as like this fake date that you can take to situations. So men hire her as their fake date. She doesn't do anything else aside from just showing up. There's no like sexual part to the whole setup, but essentially Jack is like the brother of one of the men who hired her, and so he's instantly suspicious of her when she shows up for the interview at MIT. I think the reason why I loved this book the most out of Ali Hazelwood's books is because I just really loved how tender Jack was as a character. Although he has this hard exterior, later the way that he treats our main character is just so beautiful and sweet, and you just can't help but fall for it. And I also just really loved the representation of chronic illness in this book. The main character has diabetes, and she's talking about all of the like different struggles that come along with that, and that was just really endearing to see, and I loved seeing that representation. With that said, those are all the books that I want to talk about in this video. I hope you guys got some good romance book recs to pick up soon and curl up with this winter. And as always, I would love to hear from you guys what you think of these books, and if you have any book recs for me on romances that you think I should read. As I said, I'm looking for more queer romance book recs, but I'm also looking for a lot more historical romance book recs because I've just been on a historical romance binge. So if you have book recs for either of those, please leave them down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video. So please remember that this story ain't over. Bye!